The Matterhorn, one of the world's most challenging mountains. Unconquered until 1865. That year, two rival teams were in a race to the top. British against Italian mountaineers. The triumph of the British turned to tragedy. 4 men fell to their deaths. Descendants of the climbers want to find out what went wrong. Forensic tests provide clues, and there are new sources.
It's outrageous.
Who was to blame? Was it an accident, foul play, or murder? In the Swiss village of Zermatt, 7 mountaineers met for a dangerous expedition. 4 Englishmen with 1 French and 2 Swiss guides. Their aim, to climb the Matterhorn, the Alps' last unconquered mountain.
Hello, Lord Francis Douglas.
Hudson, I'm glad you could join.
Well, gentlemen, for Queen and country.
For Queen and country.
It was the 13th of July, 1865. 36 hours later, 4 of the men would be dead. The leader of the climbing party was the ambitious young mountaineer Edward Whymper. The poor son of a London printer was determined to climb both mountains and the social ladder. For weeks, Whymper had been waiting for an opportune moment. 7 times he had tried to scale the Matterhorn. 7 times he had failed.
Here was a rather earnest young man, took himself quite seriously, but had huge ambition, was phenomenally fit. I mean, he used to walk from one end of London to the other. He'd walk right out into the countryside. He was incredibly fit. And his very first climb was a first ascent. Right from the start, he was making first ascents.
We take a 10-minute break. Do you mean eat?
He was sent to the Alps on his first visit in 1860, not to go climbing. He was working. He was sent by the publishers Longmans to do sketches to turn into engravings for an illustrated book. And that was how he made his money.
Whymper became a travel writer. The stories and illustrations of his alpine journeys were hugely popular.
Whymper was really keen on the Matterhorn. It was the Alps' last unconquered mountain, more than 4,000 meters high, over 13,000 feet. Several Englishmen desired the glory of the first ascent. For that, they needed guides.
But most local mountain guides weren't keen on climbing the Matterhorn. Too difficult, too dangerous, a seemingly impossible task. Peter Taugwalder Sr. and his son, Peter Jr. from Zermatt, were an exception, believing in an ascent from the north. Father Taugwalder, 45, was a guide of the first generation. His 22-year-old son accompanied him as porter.
Schau oben am Gipfel. Es ist nicht so steil, wie wir gedacht haben. Ja.
They too were pioneers and driven by ambition.
The
mountaineers of the time were true pioneers. They had no idea what awaited them on the mountains. Just like Indiana Jones, they were the true heroes.
2 others who were obsessed by the Matterhorn were the Reverend Charles Hudson and his young companion Douglas Hadow. Douglas Hadow was the son of a wealthy shipping magnate, an excellent sportsman and athlete, but a novice in the mountains. he would play a significant role in the unfolding drama. Pen Hadow is Douglas Hadow's great-grandnephew. Since childhood, he's been fascinated by the story of his famous ancestor. Pen Hadow is an experienced explorer who, in 2003, made the world's first solo walk to the North Pole from Canada.
The reason I have done what I have done as an explorer, indeed the reason I've been an explorer in the first place, is because of the story and the reality of what happened on the Matterhorn in 1865.
For Pen, the search for clues is also a matter of setting the record straight. For 150 years, the catastrophe has cast a shadow over the Hadow family. For it was Pen's ancestor, Douglas Hadow, who got the blame for the tragedy.
I hope that I can demonstrate that he was the fall guy, but it wasn't his fault. And I would go as far as to say he was probably the least blamable person in the entire enterprise.
In Zermatt, Pen is drawn to the mountain that proved fatal for his ancestor. It's the first time he sees it for real.
Oh my goodness. That's a very serious looking mountain, isn't it? It's seriously striking. It really is a standout peak. It's like a rough diamond that hasn't yet been cut. And I'm so pleased to have seen it lit like this with some evening light. I can totally see why people would think maybe this can never be climbed. It's pretty aggressive.
The Matterhorn has the spell of a woman and the power of a giant, an admirer once wrote. Yet, for ages, people paid little attention to the mountains, including the Matterhorn. Not until the late 18th century did scientists begin to explore the Alps, surveying glaciers, peaks, and ridges. It was the British who soon lead the way, bagging mountain peaks like trophies. Mountaineering had become a serious sport.
Well, the British like to pretend that they invented alpine climbing. They didn't. I mean, the first ascent of the Mont Blanc was made by Swiss and French climbers, but it so happened that it caught the imagination of the British.
It was the age of exploration. Alpine peaks constituted the last white spots on the map of Europe, ideal adventure territory for alpine pioneers like Whymper.
Go ahead, I'll follow. Allez-y.
By the age of 25, he'd become one of the world's most successful mountaineers, with a reputation of being curt and aloof.
A mountaineer with Whymper's objectives had to be egotistical to reach his goals. There are few sports that are more egotistical than mountaineering. His successes were down to his personality, as were his failures.
Today, it's the Matterhorn Swiss side in the north that is most famous. Back in 1865, most experts believed that the Italian south face would be easiest to climb. In Italy, the Matterhorn is known as La Gran Becca. It was on the 10th of July 1865 that Whymper arrived here in the village of Breuil, today's Cervinia. He was preparing a new attempt to climb the Matterhorn. Poor weather forced him to wait, his biggest problem to find a suitable guide. Whymper had a loose appointment with the experienced Italian guide Jean-Antoine Carrel, but Carrel told Whymper he was busy. The other mountain guides from the village were also booked. Without guide, Wimper would be unable to climb the Matterhorn that year. A rival from the British Alpine Club might well beat him to it. On the 12th of July, the weather cleared. Wimper was still without guide. The ambitious Englishman sensed that something was afoot. Carroll was heading for the Matterhorn. The Italian wanted to claim the first ascent for himself.
Carell. Sneaky devil.
Carrel had been enlisted by the Italian Alpine Club. They wanted to scale the Matterhorn with an Italian team. It was one of the last 4,000-meter mountains, and they wanted this to be an Italian victory, not least to celebrate the unity of Italy, which had only been in place for a few years.
Wimper later wrote, "The Italians had stolen a march upon me. I restudied my plans to see if it was not possible to outmaneuver them." Wimper planned to scale the Matterhorn from Zermatt.
Hold on, coming.
Nobody knows how the race to conquer the Matterhorn would have progressed if it hadn't been for a chance encounter. The young British nobleman Lord Francis Douglas arrived in Broglie. The 19-year-old mountaineer was related to Queen Victoria. He was on an extended journey across the Alps, ideal for Wimper.
Edward Wimper, I suppose. You're the talk of the Alpine Club.
Am I? So who are you?
Lord Francis Douglas. About to climb the Matterhorn.
I can see that. You have your porter. Do you also have a guide?
I do, in Zermatt.
Good. There's not much time to lose. We have to beat them Italians.
Oh, very well. Lead the way.
In record time, Lord Douglas and Wimper hurried to Zermatt. On the way was the farm of mountain guide Peter Taugwalder, known to Lord Douglas from a recent climb. Peter Taugwalder lived here with his son. The Taugwalders were poor farmers who relied on extra income from wealthy mountaineers and tourists.
Peter Taugwalder had achieved several first ascents. He was one of the best guides of his time. It wasn't a surprise that Wimper picked him as his guide.
Merci. We must depart instantly. Time is of the essence. We haben Eile.
Les Italiens sont déjà partis.
Hit which part? Moorgate. On partit demain matin de Zermatt.
Maria, tu es vino.
Circled. Very well. In the morning it'll be.
Good. I'll drink to that.
Santé.
Some people claim Peter Taugwalder went climbing because of the money. I don't think so. It was his great passion, his goal in life to be the first on the peak of the Matterhorn.
It seems that Wimper had slight doubts about Taugwalder, about whether he could really cope in a crisis. But he had to make do with who was available. All the guides in Broglie were busy on the southwest ridge. Many of the Zermatt guides wouldn't go near the Hernley Ridge. They wouldn't go near the Matterhorn. It still had this terrible aura about it. And so Wimper, desperate to seize this first ascent before Carrel, he just has to make do with the people available. So he forms this ad hoc team with Douglas and the two Taugwalders.
Time was short. In the evening, the group descended to Zermatt, their base for the Matterhorn's ascent in the morning. 45-year-old Peter Taugwalder would lead the team. Peter Jr. was quickly promoted from porter to guide. Wimper knew that this was his only chance to beat the Italians. The expedition was financed by Lord Francis Douglas. But in the evening, another rival team arrived in Zermatt. The race to the top was entering its final phase. Whymper and Douglas were staying in the Hotel Monte Rosa. It was a day full of surprises.
That night, they're dining at the Monte Rosa Hotel, getting ready for their ascent. And who should turn up but the Reverend Hudson?
Charles Hudson was England's most famous mountaineer and Whymper's competitor.
With his young friend Hadow, who won his first ever alpine season. And Michel Cros, the famous Chamonix guide, old companion of Whymper's, who had said he couldn't climb with Whymper that year, 1865, because he promised to climb with someone else. And they're going for the Matterhorn too. So after a sort of hasty conference, Whymper suggests that all 7 climbers should team up together, because it would be crazy to have 2 ropes going up the Hernley Ridge competing with each other.
They had arrived as competitors. Now they were joining forces to claim the first ascent together.
They'd never before climbed in the same team. I would never do this. If I attempt a first ascent in the Himalayas, I will prepare and train with my partner. We climb together first, so we get to know each other and learn to get on. The team was put together out of necessity. The 7 climbers who'd been thrown together were competitors and joined forces under pressure.
In the morning, the weather was looking good. The team advanced rapidly. There might still be a chance to beat the Italians. To trace the route of the historic climb, the Swiss mountain guide and historian Hermann guides Pen Hadow, the great-grandnephew of Douglas Hadow, to the slopes of the Hohlicht mountain. It lies opposite the Matterhorn's north face.
Whymper and Hudson were experienced. Whymper did a lot of difficult climbs. Hudson did many. And Douglas had just done the Obergabelhorn, which is not easy as well. But Douglas Hadow, he just walked maybe at home. Hadow is in excellent shape, and no wonder if you're 18, 19-year-old, very sporty, and it seems that he didn't see any danger. It's incredible. It's incredible if you are climbing the first time in your life, and suddenly you are in the north face of the Matterhorn.
Where no one's ever been before.
I will not do that, never.
No, this is the teenage mind at work, I think.
That's the teenage. You don't never die. I don't die.
Edward Whymper later wrote, "On the first day we did not intend to ascend to any great height, and we mounted accordingly, very leisurely, and proceeded thence along the ridge, connecting the Hernley with the Matterhorn. We were astonished to find that places which from the riffle looked entirely impracticable were so easy that we could run about. On the south side of the mountain, the Italians were taking it easy, unaware of the competition from Zermatt. Ahead of the final ascent, Carroll's men enjoyed their provisions."
They had a mule laden with food supplies, and because times were hard in Italy and the mountain people were poor devils, they probably ate everything before the ascent.
The team from Zermatt was also resting. The final assault on the peak would be made early in the morning.
If you take the binoculars, and then you see the lowest col there, and then from there they made their bivouac about 200 meters higher than the Hernley hut.
A single tent would protect the team against rain. Peter Taugwalder took care of the ropes. Michel Croix and Taugwalder Jr. were checking out the slopes above.
Croix was a wild man from Chamonix. He was the strongest man in the team, one notch up from Taugwalder. He was a right swashbuckler. He was the leader.
They came back and they say, yeah, no problem, it's not difficult at all. Even we could have done the top today.
Whoa.
Because, you know, it always seems if you are on the bottom of a face,
Yes.
it seems to be much shorter than it really is.
For the first ascent, 3 ropes had been brought over from Britain. A thin sash cord, the standard climbing rope of the time. A second spare rope was made of manila. It was hard to handle. The team's greatest pride was a new rope, specially manufactured for the British Alpine Club to provide maximum safety in the mountains. The club rope consisted of 3 pieces of manila. A red thread was the mark of the Alpine Club. The new rope was much stronger than the traditional sash cord. Unlike marine rope, the club rope was flexible. The design aimed to prevent the rope from breaking during a fall. In the evening, the 7 climbers were upbeat. For Whymper, this partnership of convenience had one drawback. He would have to share the glory should the team be successful.
Guides were deemed to be essential. So it's conceivable that Whymper had to make do with these new partners because they had the guides in tow and he had to go along with them. But he was such a powerful personality, he was such a driven man. Even if he wasn't in charge to start off with, he sort of took charge of the situation. He seemed to be the sort of person who saw himself as the natural leader.
It was the 14th of July, 1865, the day of reckoning. After dawn, both teams began their final ascent. The weather remained perfect. The team was still climbing without rope. Whymper later wrote, "The whole of this great slope was now revealed, rising for 3,000 feet, like a huge natural staircase."
The Matterhorn is extremely steep on all sides. Right from the start, you have the east face to your left and the north face to your right. Most of the time, you will follow an extremely exposed ridge. This mountain does not forgive mistakes. If you approach it without being prepared or capable, it will get you.
They reached 3,900 meters. Nobody had ever climbed this high on the Hernley Ridge. The climbers allowed themselves a half-hour break. Then the ascent continued. Nobody knew how the Italians progressed on the other side. Carrel's team was making headway, confident they would reach the peak by afternoon. Whymper's team was also progressing steadily. At 4,200 meters, the terrain was getting tough.
Up to what we now call the shoulder on the Hernley Ridge, it was all fairly straightforward. I don't think it's actually that easy. You can still fall and die there. It's not that straightforward, but it's comparatively easy. Then suddenly on this final section where the ridge rears up almost perpendicular, it suddenly is a whole different game. And according to Whymper, Crow actually said, now this is something different.
It was time to rope up. With the new club rope, Michel Crow was leading at the front.
They decided to put all the 7 people on the same rope to be stronger if somebody falls. But on the other side, you know, if 2 of them or 3 of them are falling, then the other 4 cannot hold them. So at that time, it was not so known how to use the rope.
According to Whymper, the work became difficult. In some places, there was little to hold. Snow had filled up the interstices of the rock face, leaving only occasional fragments projecting here and there.
Thinking that the ridge itself is just too steep and difficult, they traverse out. And I've been there. It's awesome, actually. You're over this immense precipice. Everything's dropping away. It's a huge, great abyss, and it's the kind of terrain which is not. It's not actually particularly difficult, but it's bits of rock with snow and ice. Some of the rock is a bit loose. It's a kind of sort of uncertain, insubstantial terrain to be moving on. It's delicate. It's awkward, where there's not that much to hold on to, and you're very conscious, you know, that one slip could be fatal.
But the mere thought of the Italian competitors kept driving the British team further and further up the mountain, across ice and rock.
They switched over to the north face on the right, hoping that this would be easier. Yet this terrain was very different to the Hernley Ridge. It is really steep, very difficult climbing. They clearly noticed this. It was a huge effort for them.
Person in the team is probably going to find this the most technically challenging and psychologically challenging. So this, of course, is Douglas Hadow, who's a teenager. This was one of those moments on the ascent where one or several of them could have used their mature mountain judgment and said, we're at risk if an inexperienced climber attempts this. This is far enough for Hadow. Maybe he should descend, and someone would have to descend with him. But that conversation, by reports, just never happened.
But nobody considered turning back. One team, one rope. Eventually, the team reached the top of the precipice. Here, the slopes are much gentler. The peak was suddenly in reach, but the team was slow, too slow for Whymper.
You can imagine Whymper, this ambitious young man with a lot of experience, and perhaps feeling he'd been held back and it'd been too slow. And finally, here was this summit of his dreams in view. Suddenly he thinks, oh, to hell with it, I'm bored with waiting, I want to get ahead. And somehow he manages to untie, slips off the loop of rope and just runs ahead to be first on the summit, just out of sheer impatience.
Michel Cros freed himself and took up the chase.
Wimper had his eye on the Matterhorn for years. He didn't want it to be taken from him. When you are this close to your goal, you have but one thought. It's mine. I want to get up there. It reveals his personality, but also his total resolve.
Wimper described the final moments of his ascent. The higher we rose, the more intense became our excitement. What if we should be beaten by the Italians at the last moment? At 1:40 p.m., Wimper and Cros reached the peak of the Matterhorn. 4,478 meters above sea level, 14,691 feet.
The idea of being the first person or the first people to reach this particular, apparently inaccessible spot is very thrilling. What a sense of relief. Oh, thank God, Carol is still down there. He didn't make it before us. Huge sense of relief. But then that relief turns to this sort of embarrassing triumphalism where he starts shouting down to alert Carol to the fact that they got there first. And then when Carol doesn't notice, they start hurling rocks down just to make quite sure that the Italians have got the message.
Italians! I beat you!
It's not the most edifying chapter in the history of British mountaineering.
Ten minutes later, the rest of the team reached the peak. It was a triumph, not only for Wimper, but for all 7 climbers. History had been made. The glory of a first ascent lasts forever. The Italians were thoroughly beaten.
The Italian climbers were very disappointed. The people in Broil thought they'd made it. It was only after their return that they realized that the others had been successful.
The victors took an hour to enjoy their triumph.
I
think Taugwalder was in 2 minds. He was happy to have scaled the peak with his son, But he was also wary. He knew that some of the climbers were not very good mountaineers. They had poor equipment. He realized what awaited them on the way down. And he was responsible for his son. All that would have made him wary.
Around 3 p.m., Krogh, Hadow, Hudson and Douglas began their descent. Whymper stayed behind to make a sketch of his moment of triumph.
Whymper lingers to make the most of this glorious moment. The others set off down, and it's agreed that Michel Krogh should go first, and immediately behind him is young Hadow. And the idea is that Krogh can help Hadow down the awkward sections, which are always going to be much harder on the descent.
To maintain unity with the leading group, Taugwalder set off next. Whymper further delayed his departure. He jotted down the names of the winning team and sealed them inside a bottle. Eventually, Whymper and Taugwalder Jr. departed. All 7 climbers were now descending. At the front, Krogh, Hadow, Hudson and Lord Douglas. Then Taugwalder catching up. He now connected to Lord Douglas using the traditional sash cord. Eventually, Whymper and Taugwalder Jr. also caught up. They connected to Taugwalder Sr. At last, all 7 men were reconnected.
All good?
Yes, it's good.
Onwards!
One rope, one team, companions in fate, connected in life or death.
You know how terrifying that particular section is, and no one's suggesting, why don't we use one of the very few rocks that do stick out as an anchor point and just have a rope hanging off it that we can use for hands and security. It's very strange, this.
They had this discussion, it seems, but then they stopped the discussion without taking a decision.
They soon reached a section which had been particularly difficult on the way up.
7 men connected by one rope. That was a huge disadvantage. Their movement was restricted. That in itself can be deadly. And then there is fear, something that must have affected young Hadow. Having to wait at a difficult section like this is like psychological torture. You want to move, even if things are getting harder. If you can't move forward, your body cools down, your muscles get stiff, and no longer have the required strength. You want to get out of there. You don't want to hang around. This section is dodgy. This is not a good place not to be moving forward.
Hadow required help. At every step, Krogh carefully positioned his boots. It was 3:10 in the afternoon when disaster struck. Krogh, Hadow, Hudson, and Lord Douglas disappeared down the mountain.
Hudson! Douglas! Douglas! Krogh! Hudson! Douglas! Hudson, can you hear me?
It goes so quick in the mountains, I tell you. 5 seconds earlier, you had strong men, happy men, teenagers, thinking that they were famous now. They have done the Matterhorn. 5 seconds later, they're just there. They disappear.
This terrible vision of these horrified faces as they slide down and then disappear. And then 3 men are left. And according to Whymper, they're almost paralyzed. They hardly move. For 30 minutes, they just stand there, just trembling with shock.
You suddenly realize what can happen during a climb. It gets into your bones and destroys your confidence. Whymper wrote that the Taugwalders were shaking and crying like young children. That is absolutely normal. It was a total shock. According to young Taugwalder, Whymper was shaking too. An Englishman can also be shaking. They were completely flabbergasted. There is only one thing you can do: remain calm.
When the bodies of Krogh, Hudson, and Hadow were found on a glacier at the bottom, they were still connected by the club rope. The body of Lord Douglas was never found. They were the first of 600 victims who have been claimed by the Matterhorn since 1865.
So we are here on the bottom of the north face, and we are more or less in the direct line from the top. And so they fell down 1,000 meters, the whole north face, and in the end you see this overhanging part here. In the end was some 100 meters free fall, and they just landed here.
What I'm most struck by is the sheer grisliness of what is found here. That's what keeps going round and round in my mind. That they did not discover whole bodies. It was very much body parts. People were being identified by shirt or trouser or belt. And so remains came pouring off this lip, really splattered on the snow. It is truly a ghastly end to what was so nearly a quite remarkable achievement.
It remains unclear exactly how the survivors managed to descend. The 3 climbers had to overcome their shock. The next 300 meters took 7 hours. The night was spent on the rock face at a height of 4,100 meters and without blankets. Wimper later wrote that he was fearing for his life. Taugwalder Jr. would state that throughout the night, not a single word was spoken. The next day, the 3 survivors reached Zermatt. They had no idea what lay ahead.
To begin with, there was a great welcome in the village. They'd been the first to climb the Matterhorn. Then the accident was discussed. Who was to blame? Who had made mistakes? All kinds of accusations were made, especially by Wimper, against Father Taugwalder.
Soon, a fierce argument erupted over what had happened on the mountain. It was an unequal contest. Wimper was a professional writer. Taugwalder was probably illiterate.
The accident attracted huge public attention. Several Englishmen had died. Douglas was a lord. The Queen commented that mountaineering should be banned. Such noble blood shouldn't be wasted on the mountains.
Pictures of the Matterhorn tragedy went around the world.
The ascent of the Matterhorn really marks the end of what we like to call the golden age of alpine mountaineering. Up till that point, there hadn't been many accidents. And then suddenly there was this terrible, shocking, horrific accident, which suddenly appalled the British public, that it was felt necessary to get it out in the open and to prove there had been no foul play, that there was no conspiracy.
In a Zermatt hotel, a court of inquiry was set up a week after the event.
Mr. Wimper, please.
It consisted of laymen. A hotelier acted as judge.
De quelle manière est arrivée la malheureuse catastrophe?
It was about 300 feet from the summit. We came to a very
Wimper
difficult
began
part.
his account with the departure from camp at 3:40 in the morning. Up until the ridge, the climb was easy. Once they were above 4,000 meters, the guide Michel Gros attached the rope. He then took over the lead. At 1:40 p.m., the team reached the summit. They stayed for an hour. The atmosphere was positive. For the descent, the team chose the same route as the one followed on the way up. All 7 climbers were connected by rope. Wimper added that the rope between Lord Douglas and Father Taugwalder was thinner than the rest of the rope.
Mr. Hadow experienced considerable difficulty coming down. Mr. Crow had helped by planting his feet in a rock hold. He then went to turn to go down himself when Mr. Hadow slipped. Mr. Hadow's fall also took down Mr. Crow. Now this double weight also dragged down Mr. Hudson and after him Lord Douglas. The few instants that this lasted afforded sufficient time for the 3 at the rear to plant themselves firmly. So firmly indeed that the rope broke between Lord Douglas and Taugwalder father.
There were no further questions and Wimper was dismissed. Peter Taugwalder was in a more difficult position. As mountain guide, he had been responsible for the climbers.
If someone allows a death to occur by not paying attention to the professional rules or out of carelessness, he could be convicted of culpable homicide. According to the laws of the Valais canton at the time, this would have carried a penalty of 2 years in prison or a fine.
Peter Taugwalder stated that before their departure, he had insisted that 2 guides were not enough for a group of this size. But Wimper and Hudson insisted that their status was equal to that of a guide. After that, Taugwalder remained silent.
Glad you could join.
The rope had always been attached by Crow, the other guide. Crow had begun the descent with Hadow, Hudson and Lord Douglas. Crow's strong spare rope was never used. According to Taugwalder, Wimper and Taugwalder Jr. lingered at the top, whereas he decided to follow the leading team. Before reaching the accident zone, he connected to Douglas. He used the Sinner sash cord for this because Lord Douglas's club rope wasn't long enough to make a connection. According to Taugwalder, the sash cord had been considered sufficiently strong. Otherwise, he would have rejected it before the ascent.
All good?
Yes, it's good.
Onwards!
Then, about 100 meters below the peak, Hadow slipped.
Fester zu stehen.
To stand firm, Taugwalder turned towards the rock face. Because the rope behind him wasn't taut, he quickly wrapped it around a rock. A life-saving anchor.
Felsvorsprung wickeln. Das hat mir die nötige und rettende Festigkeit gegeben.
Peter Taugwalder had auf alles eine Antwort gehabt.
Peter Taugwalder had an answer for everything. He said that there were several very fit climbers in the team who had experienced similar situations. But the rope between Peter Taugwalder and Lord Douglas had been thin, so why did this guide use it? He defended himself by saying that the front rope was too short to make a connection, and the thin sash cord was standard at the time. He had only recently used it in the mountains. These were pioneering times. People were still uncertain which ropes were appropriate. You also have to know that the tourists brought their own ropes. The English knew about ropes because of their maritime tradition. That's why they brought their own ropes, and that's why you couldn't accuse the guides of using the wrong ones.
Habt ihr zu den obigen Angaben noch etwas beizusetzen?
Ich bin fest überzeugt.
Taugwalder was convinced that if the rope between him and Lord Douglas hadn't snapped, he, together with Crow, could have saved the climbers.
Zusammen mit dem Vierer Gros, die Herren eigentlich retten.
Father Taugwalder believing that the rope wouldn't break, well, that's impossible. We did tests during our training courses as guides. The force of falling climbers is huge. I think what he meant with his statement is that Crow would have held them from below and he from above. But Crow also fell. He couldn't do anything.
The village considered Taugwalder a hero. Thanks to his quick response, 3 lives had been saved.
Die Aussicht. Unglaublich. Das glaube ich dir gar nicht. Alles ist wunderbar gelaufen. Und auf einmal ist es passiert. Aber ich habe mich noch mal gut gehabt. Hier. Hier siehst du, wenn man die Zeile hingeschnitten hat.
Ist gut gemacht.
Merci.
Gesundheit.
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 Ich glaube schon, als der Peter
I believe that
Taugwalder,
Peter Taugwalder had been alert enough to turn around and check where to anchor the rope.
in einer Notsituation Zeile
A mountain guide will do this automatically. You are constantly alert, looking for an anchor point should someone slip.
bereit für Zeile zu blockieren, wenn es zum Rutscher sollte kommen.
Someone of Taugwalder's caliber would have done this.
Und ich glaube, auch ein Bergführer vom Format
He was ready to react.
Taugwalder hat das sicher so gemacht. Also er ist bereit gewesen, zum reagieren.
But there were also critics and grudges in the village.
Some people claim that the locals always believed in Taugwalder's innocence. But there were other voices too. It wasn't easy for Taugwalder. Don't forget, the priest was against mountaineering. 4 people were dead. Didn't we always tell you that this is dangerous? You should stop the climbing and focus on agriculture to be content. That's how the mood gradually turned against Taugwalder.
It may explain why Taugwalder backpedaled during a second round of questioning, falling in line with Wimper's statements.
During a second session, the court wanted to know why there were discrepancies between Wimper's and Taugwalder's statements. The main issue was who fell first and who was dragged down next. An underlying question remained. Could disaster have been avoided if Taugwalder and Krogh had held the others? According to Taugwalder, this had been impossible. He had managed to wrap the rope around a rock and anchor it. But after that, the rope broke. The one thing that both witnesses agreed upon during the inquiry was that the rope had broken.
Taugwalder and Wimper also agreed on another point, the key role played by Douglas Hadow. They claimed that he had been a complete novice in the mountains. The court agreed and ruled that the disaster had been a tragic accident, caused by Hadow's slip on the mountain.
In der Erwägung, dass der Herr Hadow die Ursache vom Unglück war, wird beschlossen, dass der vorliegenden Untersuchung keine weitere Folgesellen.
To say it's his fault is ludicrous. I mean, he was invited on this climb, and if you invite someone to climb, you're responsible for them. Any one of them could have slipped. Anyone can slip on a mountain. You don't have to be inexperienced to make a mistake. Everyone can make a mistake. You could say that if someone was to blame, it conceivably could have been Hudson, that he wasn't keeping the rope tight. It could be that Michel Krogh, who was helping him down, lost his concentration for a moment, and that's why Hadow knocked him over. You can't blame an individual for an accident. An accident is caused by a multiplicity of factors.
Pen Hadow, Douglas Hadow's great-grandnephew, never fully accepted the conclusions of the local court of inquiry. In Zermatt, he continues his search for clues, together with Benedikt Perren, a descendant of the Taugwalders. In the Matterhorn Museum, the rope that broke from 1865 is on display.
Normalerweise hat man ja damals dickere Seile.
There's also a copy of the club rope with the red signature thread. The original club rope used during the accident is missing. And there are small items like Hudson's prayer book and the hat and rosary of Michel Krogh. There are shoes belonging to Lord Douglas, and particularly telling, those worn by Douglas Hadow.
What's very interesting about this boot is, if you look to this boot, you see the nails below, you know, on the sole.
Yeah.
And the one from Hadow You see, they are almost no nail.
Yeah.
Completely different kind of boot, you know. One is a real mountaineering boot where you can tie it, and you have nails on the sole, and the other one is more or less a boot to go to the church on Sunday morning, you know. So you can imagine to climb on ice with a boot like that. It's almost impossible.
I mean, it's sort of insane, to use the modern parlance. It's unbelievable.
I think it's happened because they were in a hurry, you know. Wimper had to move. The Italians were already on the way up.
Yeah.
And that's why they didn't check the equipment, you know.
That's the point, isn't it?
That's the point, yes.
Because someone might have said, really?
Yeah.
These shoes?
Yeah.
You're standing on a bar of soap. That's what you're doing. On ice. What do you think's going to happen?
But not everybody believed in a tragic accident. New clues and new theories have kept the story alive.
But then the problem is, once something gets in the public domain, the press gets hold of it. And the press isn't satisfied with that kind of bland answer. They want something more exciting. So people start spreading these conspiracy theories and rumours of cut ropes and foul play, which makes so much better press.
Rumours about the disaster spread as far as Austria. Only weeks after the accident, the Viennese paper Neue Freie Presse reported a new and sensational theory which focused on the rope that broke and on Edward Wimper. The newspaper wrote, then, as Taugwalder was losing his strength, the rope broke. Or did a knife brought into play behind Taugwalder's back cut the rope? It may be that the cut was a mere amputation, severing what had already been earmarked for death and saving those who were still standing. Yet this was a dreadful act. Trying to justify it for your own conscience must drive you to insanity. Wimper arrived in the town of Interlaken. People who knew him described him as deeply disturbed and mentally unhinged.
If it's true that the rope had been cut, we are dealing with homicide. The act would have been deliberate. In the Valais legal code, there were two provisions for this. One was murder, which is the same as intentional homicide. The other one is treacherous murder, which means that the act was premeditated. These were serious offences, resulting in lifelong imprisonment or even the death penalty.
So did the rope break or was it cut? Professor Paul Smith investigates the original at the Matterhorn Museum in Zermatt. Smith is a material science expert at Zurich's Institute of Technology.
You can see clearly how the rope was cut over here. You can tell at different sections. It's clear that this rope was cut. The end of these microfibers is vertical, and that's only possible if it was cut with a knife. You can tell from the way it was cut. For me, this is absolutely clear.
So who might have cut the rope?
It is my interpretation that Wimper is hardly a candidate. In the inquiry, Taugwalder stated that Wimper was standing much further up the mountain and that he had a much better view. This makes it unlikely, from my point of view, that Wimper charged down the slope to cut the rope, especially given the speed at which everything happened. It would have required him to pull out the knife. It all sounds unrealistic.
Then there was Taugwalder Jr., According to his father, he was behind Wimper and couldn't see anything.
If at all, it would have been cut by Taugwalder Senior, who perhaps might have wrapped the rope around a rock, hanging onto it, then realizing how he was being pulled down. 4 people dangling below him, the situation getting critical, everyone in danger of falling. So at this stage, he might have cut the rope with a knife. That would have been the most realistic scenario.
Yet, the Zermatt mountain guides are absolutely sure that Peter Taugwalder didn't cut the rope with a knife. Even Professor Smith's discovery that the rope in the museum was cut won't shake their conviction.
What you are saying is total nonsense. It's impossible. Even before the accident, somebody must have been ready, waiting with his open penknife. You have no idea how fast such accidents occur. You can tell from Peter Taugwalder's injuries caused by the rope cutting into his hands. Here was no opportunity for him to open his penknife and cut the rope 3 to 4 meters below him.
Indeed, the cut rope in the museum has only limited evidential value. It's impossible to prove that this particular cut was made during the disaster. According to Wimper, he confiscated the disaster rope immediately after the accident. In England, he had it photographed. How the rope returned to Zermatt and ended up in the museum remains unclear.
Everyone loves the story of the cut rope, but looking at it analytically and rationally, 4 men have got their weight dangling on the rope. This piece of what's little more than sash cord, this thin, thin line. I've seen it in the museum. I mean, you'd hardly trust that to pull up a window, let alone to hold 4 people falling off a mountain.
Perhaps the answer is quite simple. The rope was so weak it had to break. To find out, the strength of an exact replica of the disaster rope is tested. An expert feeds it into a rope testing apparatus. The rope is stretched. It breaks under a weight of 300 kilograms, 660 pounds. In a drop test, the rope breaks when an object weighing 85 kilograms, 187 pounds, drops a mere 20 centimeters or 8 inches. It proves that the thin sash cord connecting Taugwalder and Douglas during the descent was so weak that it had to break during the accident. The alleged cut never happened. Even the special club rope, 4 times as strong as the sash cord, might have broken given the force of the falling bodies. Yet rumors about the cutting of the rope wouldn't go away, casting a shadow over the survivors. Like Taugwalder, Wimper had his detractors, especially in the ranks of the British Alpine Club. Over the years, many of its ambitious members had been beaten by Wimper in the mountains.
You could imagine how eventually, stung by these rumours and criticisms and suggestions that perhaps he even cut the rope, Wimper would start to feel, well, actually, perhaps it's time I spoke my mind about the Taugwalders. I wasn't very impressed by them. And so finally, 5 years on, he's preparing his book, Scrambles in the Alps, and suddenly he starts to slip in these criticisms about the Taugwalders.
Wimper published his account of the Matterhorn 6 years after the disaster. He accused Taugwalder Senior of deliberately picking a thin rope, alleging that Taugwalder wanted to protect himself should the weaker climbers in front of him fall. Whymper wrote, "There remains the suspicious fact that the rope which broke was the thinnest and the weakest one that we had. It is suspicious because it's unlikely that any of the 4 men in front would have selected an old and weak rope when there was an abundance of new and much stronger rope to spare. And if, on the other hand, Taugwalder thought that an accident was likely to happen, it was to his interest to have the weaker rope where it was placed."
Das ist eine verdammte Gemeinheit vom Whymper.
This is true nastiness by Whymper, an absolutely unfair accusation. He totally destroyed Taugwalder's reputation with this. It is an insinuation.
Und das ist eine Unterstellung. Also, ich kann mir da überhaupt nicht
I can't imagine it even crossed Taugwalder's mind. Let's pick a thin rope so it snaps if I can't hold the guests.
Sonst mag ich den Gast vielleicht nicht geben, der hoffentlich zergeht der Zeil oder so.
The falling out between Whymper and the Taugwalders must have occurred in the dramatic hours after the disaster. Whymper accused them of losing their composure, followed by cruel insensitivity.
We only know of the reaction to the fall through Whymper. We have Whymper's word for it. We don't know if it's true, but according to him, the 2 guides were in a state of terrible shock. They were panicking. Not only that, he says they then started saying, well, what's going to happen to us? Are we going to be paid? Because our paymasters are now dead. Which is a pretty shocking thing to say about someone. And so eventually they pull themselves together. And if I remember right, I think at one stage Whymper actually goes ahead unroped down the mountain and the other 2 follow him. And in a state of huge shock, they make their way back down the Hernley Ridge. And eventually it gets dark and they realise they're not going to get back to their campsite. So they just stop on a small ledge and spend a night shivering on this ledge before continuing in the morning.
Whymper claimed that at dusk the Taugwalders urged him to continue the descent in the moonlight. Later, that they urged him to lie down. According to Whymper, this was done in such a menacing way that he feared for his life.
They were traumatized, and Whymper may have felt that because the others were dead, he was next. Perhaps he talked himself into this, but I don't believe that Taugwalder Senior or Junior wanted to harm him. If this is what they'd wanted, they could have done this on 100 occasions.
Whymper's accusations had a traumatic effect on Taugwalder Senior. He was already stricken following the death of his wife prior to the accident. 2 years after the disaster, his second son Joseph had drowned in the Schwarzsee, a local lake.
Hat vielleicht auch weniger Gäste bekommen und Renommee ist auch beschädigt.
He had few clients. His reputation was damaged. It's always tough for a mountain guide if there's been an accident. It's the same today. It's not something you ever want to experience.
Some superstitious villagers had started to talk of the revenge of the Matterhorn. But what hit Taugwalder the most was Whymper's statement that the old man was mentally confused and no longer fit to be a guide.
It was slander against Peter Taugwalder. As a result, he had no longer guests and was unable to work as a guide. It weighed heavily on him, financially and psychologically.
In reality, Peter Taugwalder had used a thin sash cord because no other rope was available when he connected to Lord Douglas. The second thick rope was in the backpack of Michel Cros. Yet until recently, it was never fully explained why Peter Taugwalder chose the sash cord instead of the new and much stronger rope of the Alpine Club, the rope with the red signature thread. But there is a new lead. At the world-famous Bodleian Library in Oxford, Pen Hadow has discovered letters and a book from 1965 about the tragic first ascent of the Matterhorn. Written by Sir Arnold Lunn, the father of alpine skiing and a member of the Alpine Club. The author believes the rope was cut by Whymper, not on the way down, but on the way up. A completely new hypothesis, backed up by other Alpine Club members.
Actually, the rope was cut. What a horrid fellow he was. And so perhaps it is right to let the cut rope story see the light of day.
Under scrutiny is the moment when the peak first came into sight.
Crows and Whymper were so excited that they detached themselves from the rope.
Actually, if you're moving up a mountain, to get that knot loose and then to slip out of it and then overtake someone is actually quite difficult.
Whymper reportedly confessed to a famous novelist just how he detached himself.
Whymper, after a good dinner, remarked to Mason, "Thinking it over, I believe that I did cut the rope behind me, so that I could more easily race crows to the top."
Whymper was the one who cut the rope on the way up, because he wanted to be the first at the peak. He cut himself out of the team's rope and ran off to feed his ego. That's why Peter Taugwalder was so angry about the accusation that he had deliberately chosen a thin rope. He picked the only rope that was available. In retrospect, it was too weak, but at that moment he had no other option.
After Whymper's reported cut on the way up, the strong club rope consisted of two pieces. One piece was used by the four in front, the other by those catching up. Because not enough strong club rope was left to connect the two groups, Taugwalder had to use the thin sash cord instead.
Whymper makes explicit statements that imply that his guides had somehow caused the accident by ineptitude, or worse, deliberately picking a weak rope so that they were protecting themselves. If there was an accident, they'd be all right. And now we discover that it was Whymper that cut the rope on the way up so that he could be first. If you think about it, it's outrageous.
Denying any responsibility for the accident, Whymper never wrote about cutting the rope on the way up. Instead, he accused Taugwalder of malice by choosing the thin rope.
Whymper writes a best-selling book that is read around the world that promotes him as the great leader and mountaineer. It's frankly shoddy at best from a leader who survives and gets to tell the story his way.
Until the end of his life, Taugwalder's reputation was marred by Whymper's accusations. When asked about them, he sometimes lost control.
He never got over Whymper's accusations. He was a broken man. He emigrated to America. He stayed a few years to get some distance to the Matterhorn. He then returned to Zermatt and took a share in the construction of the local Schwarzsee hotel.
Und hat sich am Bau vom Hotel Schwarzsee nachher beteiligt.
Peter Taugwalder died at the age of 68. But the curse of the Matterhorn's tragic first ascent also weighed heavily on Whymper. His books provided him with financial independence, but he was denied the social elevation he so desired. In September 1911, Whymper suffered a stroke in the Grand Hotel Coutet in Chamonix. At the age of 71, he died a lonely man.
I believe the disaster at the Matterhorn left a mark on him for the rest of his life. There was a certain sadness about all his stays in Chamonix. He died alone, just as he had been alone for most of his life. He had no real friendships after the Matterhorn. A man who died embittered and all alone in his room. Whymper's funeral was attended by many people from Chamonix and its surrounding area. The mountain guides walked next to the hearse to pay this great mountaineer their last respects. Even today, the name Whymper is considered a big mountaineering name in Chamonix.
When news of Whymper's death reached Zermatt, many locals commented that the Matterhorn had finally got its revenge. But officially, the people of Zermatt celebrated Whymper as a great British hero. After all, nobody wanted to scare off the English guests nor stifle the fledgling tourism in the region. Outside the Hotel Monte Rosa, a plaque commemorates his success.
And here we are. So, Mr. Whymper.
The Taugwalders get no mention.
Whymper was a blessing for the village. The disaster attracted huge newspaper interest, especially in England. People flocked to Zermatt. They wanted to see the mountain and the spot where disaster had struck. It was the starting point for tourism in the region. Zermatt became the big winner of the tragedy from 1865.
Taugwalder's descendants, Alex Perren on the right and Arthur Taugwalder, have always been disappointed that Zermatt mainly celebrated Whymper as the one who made the first ascent. Eventually, 90 years after the tragedy, a plaque was attached to the Taugwalders' home, commemorating their achievement as companions of Edward Whymper.
The English were always the pioneers, but it's still not correct what happened. Even today, when people ask who first scaled the Matterhorn, the answer is Whymper. Nobody talks about the Taugwalders. It hurts. The people of Zermatt could have said that Whymper was successful together with the Taugwalders. It wouldn't have resulted in less or more English tourists, and nobody would have felt insulted. There are also other examples, though much later. Take Sir Hilary, who climbed Mount Everest with Sherpa Tenzing, and who remained a great friend and supporter of the region. The example shows that other kinds of relationships were also possible.
The last survivor of the catastrophe, Peter Taugwalder Jr., continued his career as mountain guide. He would receive his guests, usually foreign mountaineers, in front of the Hotel Monte Rosa. Destination, Matterhorn. When gazing at the hotel on the Schwarzsee Lake, his father's words might have been ringing in his ears. What a pity that Whymper survived, and not the friendly Lord Douglas. The locals gave Taugwalder Jr. the epithet Matterhorn Peter.
He went his own way, he had many guests, and became a highly renowned mountain guide. He climbed the Matterhorn 125 times.
In his old age, Peter Jr. retreated further down the valley, away from the Matterhorn, away from too many questions. He lived out his final years in this simple hut, surrounded by his numerous children and grandchildren. In March 1923, he died of natural causes, aged 80. It took a long time for the Taugwalders to be rehabilitated. The delay was partly their own doing.
As a young boy, I often visited my grandmother in Weiler zum Biel, where they lived. No word was ever spoken about the first ascent or about mountaineering. My uncle was also a mountain guide, and yet it was never mentioned. Why? I don't know. It remains a mystery.
Even today, 150 years after the first ascent, the Matterhorn is a magnet for mountaineers from around the world. At the end of his investigation, Hadow decides to visit the spot where his great-granduncle fell to his death. Together with the experienced guide Benedikt Perren, he's looking for clarity.
Hadow slipped, you know? And then Peter Taugwalder was at that moment, he was in this position here.
Yeah.
And he was able to put the rope around this block here, like that. He could stop the fall.
Yeah.
And this block could hold the load, but not the rope.
I think it's really powerful for me because it's obvious that this is the rock, and it's important to me to really do the micro detail of these last few moments, and it's the only one around here. We're one step away from where the slip that caused the fatal accident happened. First Crows, then Hadow, then Hudson, and then Lord Douglas go down this line, and then they're gone. Taugwalder, he hears the shout from Crows. He looks up, maybe, sees a limb going, grabs the rope down like this. Oh, he's pulled down like this. And they've gone. That's it. This fast. All out of their comfort zone, out of their experience zone. Of course they were doing their best, or they knew they were going to die. They did their best, and it wasn't good enough, and that's life, and that's death in the mountains.
One question remains. It's the same question posed 150 years ago. Is it worth risking your life for a mountain peak? It's time for Hadow to visit his ancestor's grave for the very first time.
Well, Douglas, we meet at last. You've waited 150 years for this. Much of what I've done in my life has been inspired by you and what you did. Your ambition and your drive, and indeed your achievements, inspired me throughout my life. Thank you.
Was it an accident, foul play, or murder? Even the latest clues can't fully answer this question. Only the mountain knows the answer, and the mountain remains silent.